Hey there and welcome to this video podcast. It's a joint production between GoClassics magazine and Brown Car Guy. I'm Shazad Sheikh, aka the Brown Car Guy, and as well as being a motoring journalist and content creator for over 3 decades, I'm also the media editor and a columnist at GoClassics. Now, if you haven't seen it yet, issue 5 is out now. It's brilliant. It's packed full of lots of great features, including, of course, the best thing of all is my column. Shock. Electric classic cars aren't so bad after all. Is he mad? Has he gone crazy? Well, you'll have to get the magazine to find out. Go read it. You can get print or digital copy at goclassics.co.uk right now. So today, my guest is Martin Gurdon, and he writes about cars for the London Evening Standard, Daily Telegraph, Spectator Online website, as well as other titles. He's also a judge for the Motor Trader Awards. He's also an author with 9 books to his credit. Damn, I'm jealous already. And they include The Bluffer's Guide to Cars and Hen and the Art of Chicken Maintenance. Let me just repeat that last one. Hen and the Art of Chicken Maintenance. We're going to ask him about that and also about his first car, which was a Honda Z600, which he bought for 5 pence from his dad. And these days he rocks around on a 1989 Skoda 120L saloon, which is the Estelle. Welcome, Martin. How you doing?
I'm still alive. And thank you for the kind words. You haven't read any of my books. You might feel quite substantially less jealous if you had.
I'm just jealous you got an actual book with your name on it. I want to be that person one day, you know.
How can I express this? It does buffer the ego somewhat, but it depends how many you sell and how people respond to them. I mean, you look on Amazon and some critical opprobrium comes your way, and you think, "Oh, really? I slaved over that," and all you can do is be cruel. So, if you have a fragile ego, beware.
You know what? I can totally relate to that. I mean, I do videos. So you can imagine, I do videos on YouTube. You can imagine the comments I've had in the past. I'll tell you that much. I might come back to that because it's quite weird. But I know that as well as writing books and reviewing cars, but you've worked also with our esteemed editor, haven't you, Alan Anderson, in the past? So what was that on?
Well, right. Well, that's going back to the early 2000s. The Evening Standard had a weekly motoring supplement called ES Wheels, and I was the commissioning editor. And dear Alan used to write lots of things for us, but he mostly wrote a sort of specialist second-hand car column where he would review a car, what to look for, and stuff like that. And he had... he still has an encyclopedic knowledge of vehicles and their quirks and weaknesses and strengths, and he was great. He was lovely to work with, and I learned a lot from knowing him.
That's awesome. Unfortunately, he was going to join us for this podcast, but unfortunately, there's an illness in his family. We wish him all the best and hope absolutely. That everybody's doing well and okay. But yeah, I mean, one of the things I've found since, when you come back and you start to talk to people, and everybody in our community, and I'm talking about the community of automotive journalists in the UK, for example, is very well connected. And often people tend to know each other and have at some point worked with each other. There's a real sort of camaraderie, isn't there?
Yeah, it's a bit like the mafia. We all know. I think with freelance, which is what I do, I liken it rather to being a shark. You have to keep moving because if you stop, you die. And inevitably, the longer you do this, and I've been doing this since the 1890s or the early 1980s, you kind of meet people along the way. So
basically when the cars first came about.
Yeah, I mean, we'd got rid of the guy with the top hat and the red flag walking in front of it. It's a long time ago. Sorry?
That was your first job?
It was. Actually, my first job, I have to confess, my first job was a cycle messenger boy. And we really are going off topic here, but I was a cycle messenger boy for a manufacturing optician on the Goldhawk Road in Shepherd's Bush. And I used to have a terrible Humber girl's bicycle with a bent front fork because the mudguard was rattling, so I kicked it and my foot got tangled up in the wheel and whacked against the front forks, and over the front of it I went. And it sort of had steering that cranked after that. And I would cycle round the White City roundabout before they put traffic lights in it with two carrier bags on my drop handlebars filled with repaired glasses worth hundreds of pounds. And that was my introduction to the world of work, and the apex of my career. Sorry, we're wandering.
Yeah, no. So back to the clique of automotive journalists.
Yeah.
So this is how did you get into car journalism then?
Well, how long have you got? I've
got my tea, so I'm all right. So.
Well, yeah. Well, I mean, I'll wake you up in a quarter of an hour or so. I went to a peculiar vegetarian coeducational boarding school run by Quaker hippies in Hertfordshire, where they said you learn when you're ready, and and I wasn't, and basically I needed a size 14-inch boot, 6 inches from my backside. And I left school with very few qualifications, did lots of dead-end jobs, hence the cycle job. But my dad had funny old cars. He had Javelins, he had a Bristol 2-litre, things like that. And I was interested, and I liked writing, and I thought it would be fun to put the two together. But who was going to employ me? I didn't have a degree. I didn't have any contacts. But Car Magazine used to have its editorial offices over a bank in Smithfield near the market. And I was working in the area. And one lunchtime, I just turned up on the door, and I was 19 years old, banged on the door and said, "Hello, I want to be a motoring journalist." And this is when Steve Cropley was editing it. And they said, "The editor's out. There's the lift. Go away and write." Shove, another one. So I wrote a letter to him, hand wrote it because I couldn't type, with some ideas. And anyway, he rang up and said, "Your letter is articulate. You showed some initiative coming to see us. I don't think much of your ideas, but at least you had some. Give me 1,000 words on the Fiat Topolino, the original 1930s Dante Giacosa design one. And if it's good enough, I'll print it and I'll pay you for it." And I did about 14 rewrites, and bless him, my dad would come home from work and get me to read it aloud. So we debugged this thing because it was pretty awful to start with. Got into print. And very gradually, I built up a sort of freelance portfolio. Then I ended up as an industrial relations journalist, as a junior reporter on an industrial relations magazine, where they taught me, where I stopped being an amateur writer who got published. They then taught me to become a journalist, and eventually I went freelance at the turn of the 90s. And I've been working for myself and mostly writing about cars, but I do write about other things ever since. I'm a word tart. If people pay me money to write about stuff, I'll do it.
So do you think that the non-automotive stuff helped you along your path? Did that give you a good grounding and understanding of what we call journalism or what we call media?
Yeah, I think it taught me. I mean, one of my first early commissions was a woman's magazine called Options, which was, I didn't realize it was run by some of the best magazine journalists in the country at the time. And I would write something and they'd come back and they'd say, "What's a spoiler? What's this? What's that?" And it taught me that actually, if your work isn't going to be kind of ghettoized, it needs to make sense to somebody who knows more about the subject, whose sort of automotive G-spot is in the detail. So that's right. But equally, you want to pull in people who, they're at the doctor's waiting room or they're on a train and they see something you've written and they read it because it's there. And my feeling is, you're saying to them, you might not think this is interesting, but you will be interested in it. And that pulls people into the subject. So that's something I've always tried to do. And I think having outside influences does help your work. But mind you, having said that, there are plenty of fantastic writers who've done nothing but write about cars. That's what they want to do. And they have a different approach. It's just as valid, but it's different.
I think it's a very valid point, though. I think because often people ask me, what do you actually do? And I say, what I actually do is communicate. And I think that's ultimately what it's always been about. Because if you don't know how to communicate people in a style and terminology that they understand, then you're basically, shouting to yourself inside a cocoon. It doesn't really make any sense to anything, does it?
Yeah.
So, and I think that, because I've also, like you, I've spent a portion of my career not doing automotive stuff, but, doing local magazines, doing local politics, all this sort of stuff, doing some financial stuff, and while at the time I was like, God, this is not what I want to be doing. This is such a waste of time, But now when I look back and I go, well, actually, that stuff really helped me, because that helped me to
Yes.
learn how to communicate different things to different audiences.
Yeah, and I think specialist journalism, whether it's cars or industrial design or clothes, fashion, it can be. I mean, I need to express this with care, but it can become a little ghettoized. So you'll find, I've seen on occasions people, and I've read stuff and thought, you're basically writing for your peers,
Yes.
and that I think limits what you can do as a journalist, and limits your readership. And you might have talents that you've yet to really develop, that you never develop because you're just writing for the same clique, as you put it. But I mean, that's a personal view.
No, I agree with you. I share that, actually. I think that sometimes we do tend to end up, we find people within our realm that are actually writing for each other. Sometimes it feels like, and you're not actually reaching out to an audience. But then, to be honest, the scene itself has changed so much in the last
Yes.
couple of decades, hasn't it?
Oh,
Because
yeah.
from going to where publications ruled and they were massive sales and massive circulations, to really now people are holding on to, if you like, the last, we're here as part of GoClassics magazine, so I should be careful what I'm saying, but we're holding on to the last vestiges of print publications.
Yes.
Whereas a lot of the audience is moved into what we're doing right now, which is into a digital medium. And I guess it's a case of understanding how to adapt our ability to communicate in order to reach
Yes.
that audience. Otherwise, what are we doing?
Well, it's people are interested in learning about stuff and reading about stuff or having it communicated to them. I mean, the fact that we're two middle-aged gentlemen talking to each other using this technology, I think is a sign of how much things have changed.
It's a miracle.
You've made it work. I mean, I tell you also, I have an inverse aura with techie stuff. I mean, I'm surprised that there isn't smoke coming up behind you, because it sees me coming and goes no. But anyway, sorry, we've wandered again, haven't we? Well, so what were you saying? I'm very old.
So
and I
the fact that
stuff.
we are actually doing this, and the fact that we've actually learned, I guess, to adapt.
But that's what makes life interesting. I think I mean, I do some product journalism. I do some new road test stuff. I don't do that much of it because, and again, I need to express this with care. It can be fun. The cars can be interesting. You can find interesting angles to write about them, but it's essentially the same experience. And I want to do other things. And I think, generally speaking, people are more interesting than mechanical objects, however cleverly engineered they are, or aesthetically attractive they are, or exciting. So, I mean, I'm happiest when I'm doing automotive journalism, writing about people doing something with their cars, or have the connection the car has to them in their lives, stuff like that. I mean, color journalism, I suppose.
I think that's a very good point, because I often say that we all love cars, but cars ultimately are static objects. And often it's the people, either the people that have been involved in the creation of the car, or the people that own the car, that actually really make the story and really bring that car to life. And this is what I love about going to classic car events and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Because you look at the car and you think it's a beautiful object, and you look at the presentation and you marvel at it. But it's not until you speak to the owner that the story of that car really starts to come alive.
Yeah, it's great for people watching, isn't it? I mean, I remember many years ago going to a microcar rally up in the Midlands, and I met this lovely middle-aged guy who, I mean, this was about 25 years ago now, and he had a Messerschmitt KR200, a little sort of cigar-shaped three-wheeler, one wheel at the back, two at the front. And his first car had been a Messerschmitt. His dad had bought it for him when he was 17, and he'd done his courting with the lady who was now his wife in this thing. And anyway, he sold it and bought a minivan, and had forgotten all about the car. But it had a minor prang at the front and had been welded just at the sort of base of the snout. And he was at a classic car auction, and he there was one of these things up for sale, and this was about 30 years afterwards. And just out of interest, he looked in the cabin and saw this repair, and it was his car. and he found it completely by
Wow.
accident. And they told the auctioneers, and the auctioneers said, "Well, are you going to bid?" And he got it. He got it back, and his wife and he goes on holiday with it. And I mean, it's an object with a connection to a really important and formative part of his life, and it's a lovely story.
Yeah, yeah. And the cars make the story. I mean, let's get into your own first car. So the Honda Z600, which in itself is an extremely rare and unusual car in this
Yeah.
market. So to even have access to one of that is surprising. But then to be able to buy it for 5 pence, I mean, is that the cheapest car in the history of cheap cars?
Well, I've actually been given a couple of cars. I mean, I tend to
Right.
drive old bangers. I mean, that's one of the cheapest. I mean, I had an old lean burn engine Toyota Corolla Toyota Avensis, which is about as exciting as a Mogadon and margarine sandwich. But I had that for 2 years and did about 50,000 miles in it. That was basically that we got that on. I'll talk about the Honda in a minute. We got that on Valentine's Day. It belonged to a friend of a friend. Her father had it, and he passed away, and he was sitting on their drive. And it was a bit like the vet ringing up and saying, "We've got this kitten. It's very sweet, but it's got a wonky eye. But if you don't have it, we're going to have it put down." So I rescued this thing, and my other car went pop about 3 months later. So I started driving it and drove it until it went round the clock. It did just about done 200,000 miles when the cat gave out on it. But the Honda, my dad lived on a houseboat on the River Thames. And his neighbour had this thing. And for those who don't know, the Honda, it was smaller than a Mini. It looked like an egg, television screen back window, 600cc, air-cooled all-alloy, roller-bearing engine, 4-speed dog box, no synchromesh. Very interesting little car. Anyway, the car park was lower than the river, and there was a very high tide, and this thing got up to its door handles in water. So my dad bought it for about 150, 200 quid from the original owner, dried it out with a hairdryer, filled the box sections of the sills with foam, and he drove it for about 3 years until he wanted something a bit newer. So I then inherited it. And I mean, it looked like the wrath of God by this stage. It was a 70s Japanese car that had been immersed in river water.
Well, I was going to say, I was shrieking in horror when you said that, because even without that aid of water, Japanese cars of that era would tend to rust to nothing anyway.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's a bit like 60s Vauxhalls. I mean, I think they used reconstituted steel a lot of the time, and it sort of oxidized. I mean, this thing, the exhaust was held together with Jubilee clips and gun gum. And, I was no stranger to filling holes with plastic padding. But it was going. I did an engine swap on that.
Really?
The cam started clattering, and I bought one for 50 quid that had been rammed up the backside. And the engine sits on a subframe, and the whole engine and transmission. And what we did was we unbolted all the suspension bits and the 4 bolts that held the engine to the underside of the car, and disconnected everything. And we had the 2 cars side by side. And my dad and I and a couple of other houseboat owners got one car by the front bumper, picked it up and wheeled it out of the way like a wheelbarrow over the top of one engine, and then wheeled the other car and dropped it over the good engine. And I bolted everything back up. So that was quite a formative experience.
My goodness. I mean, that sounds amazing. How long did you actually have that car?
I had that for about 3 years, and eventually there was a charging fault. I wish I still had it. There was a charging fault with it, and I sold it to a man who had a Barclay 3-wheeler.
Wowzers.
And he was, I mean, they were front-wheel drive. I think they had Anzani 2-stroke engines, those. And he wanted something with a bit more oomph and a bit more power. So somewhere out there is just possibly a Barclay with a Honda Z engine that has a tenuous connection to my car. That car would do an indicated 80. I mean, it was like a little motorcycle engine. I mean, it didn't handle terribly well. It had a beam axle at the back and a couple of cart springs. So and when they were on, I had radial tires on them, but the original spec was skinny little cross plies with sidewall stiffness of a blancmange. So, if somebody spat on the road, the car handled like a windscreen wiper. But I mean, they don't make them like that anymore. And I have
thank enormous,
God. enormously fond memories of it. I mean, people, I think, look at cars as a commodity, something you buy by the yard with the PCP finance packages.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it was an old heap, but it had a certain scrofulous romance about it.
I like that. But talking of old heaps, I mean, this is something that you still subscribe to today. I mean, your Skoda, 1989. I mean, is that your daily driver?
No,
Okay.
God, no.
I was like, whoa.
My daily driver is a 2006 Honda Jazz because I'm rapidly reaching.
Oh, those are good.
Reaching my it is good. He's got the usual business. The boot fills with water. I mean, my dad bought it new. I mean, they all do this. They all leak. Yeah. And I've got through 2 back boxes and 2 lots of rear brake calipers. It's the CVT, so it sounds like a demented sewing machine. But it's basically it's a resource. It's the most unromantic thing going. So I've got that. The Skoda is a very late model 4-speed one with the swing axles. I forget what the engine's power output is. It's not enormous. I bought it from a couple of follically challenged brothers in Liverpool about 6 years ago. And I just thought, I want something a bit different that's a bit of fun that doesn't involve a lot of emotional capital. And this thing drives like something from 1960. And I know they have a terrible reputation for dodgy swing axle handling in the wet, but Porsche sorted the suspension. I mean, you wouldn't want to explore its limits of adhesion because I think once it let go, it would keep going. But it's not bad. And actually, just for pootling down the lanes, I live in the Weald of Kent, the last bit of Kent before it gets flat and weird and becomes Romney Marsh. It's ideal for sort of 40, 50 mile an hour pottering down country lanes, taking the dog for a walk and things. I'm very fond of it, and it has a sort of inverse coolness that it didn't have when it was new. I mean, basically, they were aimed at blokes with no teeth and flat hats who bought the car when they retired and kept going till they stopped driving.
It's interesting, isn't it, how cars sometimes they come of age later on. I was at the NEC show with Jeff, who's the editor at large and founder of GoClassics, one of the founders of GoClassics, and he was looking at a Citroen. He's owned about over 100 cars, and he's looking at a Citroen 2CV, and he says, that's the one car I've never owned. And I was like, how has that evaded you? Because he's had a quite an eclectic mix of different things. And he said because it wasn't cool at the time. He said, but now it is. And suddenly he's looking at it going, I think I should own one of these now.
I would disagree with Jeff. I think they had a sort of mung bean and tofu coolness right from the get-go. Actually, I owned a Citroen Diane 4. Which is the same car with a sort of origami.
It's a sort of more upmarket 2CV, isn't it?
Relatively. But being the Diane 4, this had a 435cc engine rather than 602, so it was even more glacial. And they had inboard drum brakes that were on the inside of the chassis rails.
Right.
And when I bought it, the guy who sold it to me was a friend, and he said, well, it's got leaky slaves, let's change them. So we took the front of the car off, which you could do with a Phillips screwdriver and a sense of adventure. Wow. And you were supposed to disconnect the drive shafts to get the drums off. But what we did was we unbolted everything so the drums would slide along the drive shafts, and then 2 of us bounced the car up and down on the front bumper with our feet. So it was going boing, boing, boing. And on the down slope, when as its nose hit the tarmac, we pulled the drum over the top of the chassis rail, and the car came up and the drum was on the outside. We could then change the slaves and then bounced it and put it back. I mean, I've got all my fingers. But, I mean, we were lucky. No, I mean, I would recommend the De Chevaux. I mean, not much fun in an accident, but a really individual and fun driving experience.
Yeah, no, it is a lot of fun, actually. I remember driving one in Dubai, and it's funny you're talking about, bouncing the car up, because the friend of mine, Mohammed Musleh, who owned that car at the time, I've got a picture of him, and he looks like he's lifting the car up as the Incredible Hulk. And what he was actually doing, he was bouncing it, and I managed to catch the picture just on the uplift, and it literally looks like he's hoisting the car up with his hands,
And actually, they do handle surprisingly well. I mean, they roll. I mean, because the cabin was very narrow. I discovered that if when I was going into a right-hand bend, if I put my left foot against the opposite side of the footwell where the passenger was, and looked at the horizon rather than the angle of the windscreen, you could go around a corner at almost any speed. And I got stopped by a copper going around Chiswick Roundabout on the door handles at about 2 a.m. And he said, "You don't need to tell me that thing isn't going to fall over. But if somebody's, but nobody else knows that, and you're going to cause an accident, so be more careful. I don't want to scrape you off the road."
Yeah. Fair enough. So these cars that we're talking about, the Honda Z600, the Skoda, the Citroen 2CV. I mean, the Citroen 2CV actually doesn't really apply, I guess, because that's very obviously subscribes to what I'm going to ask is, do these cars all fall into the category of being classics?
Well, I think you could say they're classics of their kind. I mean, there's a real market for the Skodas. There's, the guys in the Czech Republic. I had a Rapid Coupe for a bit, which I've just sold.
Wow.
And I sold it to a Czech guy.
Those used to make for good rally cars, didn't they?
They did. Well, I mean, the saloons did. The little S100s, the ones with which looked like 3 cardboard boxes joined together. The Skoda engineers were quite. They were talented people. Was not very promising raw material. They got some good results, and the fact that you don't, rear-engined cars with the engine dangling over the axle line. I mean, that was very much a post-war European design trend. There were lots of Fiats like that, lots of VWs, Simcas. That stuff has all disappeared, and the Skoda is really the last vestige of that. So, you get a particular dynamic with it, which actually is rather appealing. I mean, it's niche. And whether with electrification, there's going to be a long-term market for niche cars, ICE cars like that, I don't honestly know. But at the moment, people have thought, yeah. So I would say that's a classic. The Honda Z, I mean, they check the few survivors. If you see one for sale, it's going for 5 figures if it's any good.
Wow.
So they're definitely very collectible. I wish I still had mine. I mean,
I think classics are pretty much defined by if there's somebody in the world that has some kind of a sentiment or affection for that car and is willing to pay over the odds for it, it's a classic. And that extends, I personally think that extends to everything, because there's a show that takes place here, which I haven't been to yet. And every year I keep thinking I should go to that. I think, is it called was it Concourse of the Unremarkable or something like that? There's a show like that here, isn't it?
Yeah, I knew what it was called, but my mind's gone a beautiful blank. It's something like the pageant of the unexceptional.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah,
and it's go and polish your Austin Maxi. And I mean, a friend of mine, Giles Chapman, who's a classic car journalist, really good. I mean, he said his definition of a classic is it got chrome bumpers. But right. I think, stuff where people had, we're going back to this thing that people had early memories of family holidays or, learning to drive or meeting your first girlfriend or boyfriend or whatever it was. And, you'll open a door of something like a Morris Marina or a Maxi that were absolutely slated by people like me back in the day, and with some justification, because they were expedient and they broke. And you'll get a certain industrial production waft from the seats and the plastic trim, and it takes you back. Suddenly it's 1978 or 1999 if it's something. But I mean, there are plenty of cars that were significant bits of industrial design that I think will disappear. I mean, the original P10 Nissan Primera, the first one, that was a brilliantly conceived car, lovely to drive, very clever. I mean, I owned a couple of those. I don't think, and the EGT was the performance one. That had a certain cachet, but they've all gone. And I think that things like that will just oxidize and disappear and be forgotten about.
Yeah. But again, conversely, if there is one around, then by default it becomes a classic simply because of the rarity of the thing, So it's kind of, I mean, I do think, and especially, one of the things I found since I've been back in the UK is a bit like you. I used to subscribe to the James Ruppert School of Bangonomics, and I used to, at the time when I was here before, I would regularly buy and sell stuff off eBay. Because you could get a very good car for very little money, and it was perfectly
Yes.
possible. I find that's much harder now because so much great old stuff has either been scrapped or just got rid of or just died.
I think so, and the cars are so much more technically dense.
Mm.
And I think if you live in London, that kind of motoring is impossible because of ULEZ and things. And I
Yeah,
don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. Everything has a shelf life, even you
yeah.
and me. That stuff was fun, but I think we're moving into a different world where you know there isn't room for it, but there will be other interesting things instead.
Talking of different worlds, let's talk about the art of chicken maintenance. It's the hen and the art of chicken. What is that? You got to
Right.
explain. I mean, that title is one that just makes you stop dead in your tracks and go, "What?"
Well, when I was working at the Standard, I was commuting up and down from rural Kent to London on the old Rattly slam door trains into Charing Cross, and I had this dead time. And there's a terrible cliche, which is everybody has a book inside them, and the rest of it, which you never hear, is yes, and mostly that's where it should stay. And we keep chickens and ducks. I kept them as a little bit as a child. I
Right.
lived with relatives in Lancashire and worked on a battery farm and collected eggs and had chickens. And my wife started saying, "You'd like to keep chickens again, wouldn't you?" And eventually this turned out to really mean I'd like to keep chickens as long as you muck them out. And so we had a few birds at the bottom of the garden, and it was like a sort of feathery soap opera of sex change cockerels and power struggles, and general nonsense. And I'm a feature journalist. I'm an opportunist, and I thought there's a story in here. And I thought, well, I could write a book about my or our interaction with these birds and some of the funny things that happened. And I don't have to do any research. I could write it as a stream of consciousness. So I wrote this thing on the train. Never wrote and never written a book before. And the Standard had a property supplement. And the editor of that said, "Give me 500 words on moving to the countryside and keeping chickens, and I'll say you're looking for a publisher." And I got a publisher, and it's been. I've written lots of other books since. I mean, I would describe that book as my medley of hit.
Right.
Which is
Medley
ripping off
of
some.
hit.
Yeah, because it's. I mean, it's sold about 20,000 copies. It's been
Wow.
reprinted about 3 times. It is still in print. I think anybody who wanted to buy it probably has by now. But it led to a whole peculiar afterlife. I wrote a sequel called Travels with My Chicken, and it only
right.
published. And that came out in the middle of the bird flu scare.
Oh my goodness.
And I'd been starting to do promotions where I'd go to bookshops with a chicken and talk about sex, death, and chickens, and and it went from, "Oh, that's a bit of fun," to, "Oh, he's bringing a plague animal with him. Go away." And my second book got remaindered. Actually, the only publicity it got was there was a top 10 list of travel books with stupid names in the Metro newspaper, and my book was number 7.
That's
But
the
I
first
bought.
book. That's the hen and the art of
No,
chicken maintenance.
that was
This
Travel
is the
with
second
My
one.
Chicken.
Travel with my chicken. My
That was the only.
goodness.
Yeah, it's out there on eBay if you've got 25p.
But the first book, that is
Yeah.
inspired by another book title, isn't it?
Yes, Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. I mean, I'd written 3/4 of the book, and I remember this, that I was on the train. I thought, well, a title will come, and it just. I had my laptop and I was just typing away, and suddenly it just rolled onto the page, and there it was. And I've never knowingly undersold an awful pun, and it worked quite well, really. Yeah. But I'm again, that's going outside the subject, and so that was fun. And I wrote that book 20 years ago, and it's still, people still tap me on the shoulder and say, "Did you write that funny book about chickens?" So yeah.
And is that? I mean, you've written, obviously, got the Bluffer's Guides to Cars and stuff like that. So that's sort of, if you like, a humorous approach to content. Have you translated that into stuff that you've done based on automotive?
Yeah, I mean, I try and keep it light, and it's more. I find it more interesting to write. I mean, I don't just do that. I do serious news analysis stuff. I do write news. But I mean, for instance, I wrote about the Rolls-Royce Ghost Black Badge recently, and which I think you were on the same launch where they
Yes.
launched the thing at night.
Yes.
And I mean, you're a motoring journalist. I'm a journalist who writes about motoring. I'm technically literate, but I have slow hand-eye coordination. I'm a very average driver as a result. And there are all these, gimlet-eyed, serious types wanting to explore its limits of adhesion. And I thought, this is worth more than my house.
Yeah.
So I wrote about what the car did dynamically, but I also described the event and how basically, in one way, I was the wrong guy for it. So you had a little bit of fun. So again, it's appeared on the Standards website. Again, the audience I was thinking was somebody who's had a hard day at work and has found this thing on the train and would never normally read about a car and starts reading it, and it tells a story, and they're hooked and brought into it. So I'm banging on, aren't I?
No, but you're quite right. I actually agree with you. I think that that was an unusual launch event because, like you say, they did it at night, and the only dynamic element of it was actually trying to race up and down an airstrip. But when it comes to a Rolls-Royce Ghost, I mean, it's a car that it's so elevated, it's so up there, and so out of reach for a lot of people that, and I'm with you on this. I think that, all the journalists, they go, I need to know what it feels like at 10/10s, and I need to know where the limits are, and I need to know if it understeers over. And I'm like, nonsense. Nobody needs to know that. People need to know, what does it feel like to ride in a Rolls Royce? That's all they really want to know. They don't really care what it can do dynamically. It's just, what's the experience like?
It's like driving a dynamically taut sofa, isn't it? And I mean, it's hypercars like that. I mean, I have written about them. I don't write about them very much. It's, the world doesn't need cars like that, but I try and write honestly about them, and say it's good at this, it's less good at that. As you say, it feels like this, it looks like that. And treat it as it's a product review at the end of the day. It's a
product review, but it is, but it isn't, because if it's a product review, then you're getting very technical about it. But when you're talking about things like Rolls Royces or Bentleys or Ferraris or Lamborghinis, you're not being technical, you're being emotive, because that's what those cars mean to a lot of people.
Yes,
the vast majority. It's one of the things I found about when I went to the Middle East and I took over. So I basically was doing Car Magazine. So I was doing the Middle East franchise edition of Car Magazine there. And one of the things I found about it was the audience was slightly different to here, because here I found that a lot of the audience is aspirational. They're reading about those cars. They're living they're living the life of the journalist like a proxy through the magazine. So they're getting the experiences of what it's like to drive the car. In the Middle East, it was different because the audience there owned those cars. So you couldn't actually tell them what the car was like because they already knew that. So what you were actually talking to them about was how the car made them feel and why it would fit into their lifestyle and why it was, why the Gallardo was better than the 488 or whatever. That would be appropriate to the way that they lived.
Yes, and again, you're into high-end specialist journalism, and I think if you're writing for Car Magazine, there is an assumption that your readership is interested in cars and knows something about them, or if they don't know something about them, they want to learn about them. So that has a different focus. I mean, writing for a newspaper, I want people who are in those zones to get something from it. But equally, you can't assume everybody's interested.
No, that's quite right. But also, like, just to bring this to a close, I mean, do you think that our colleagues in the field of automotive journalism sometimes just take themselves too seriously?
I'm going to preface this. I mean, I feel although I've done this for 100 years, I'm a bit of an outsider. I think that I encounter young men who I'm now old enough to be their dad, and fortunately for them, I'm not their dad. I think there's more talent, more diversity, more skills in the business now than when you and I started. It's not all just gimlet-eyed blokes. I mean, but there is, I think that there's an element of that's a bit po-faced. But it's a big world, and I think there are worse sins than that.
True. Fair enough. I think that's a good point to wrap up on, because it's like, it's things aren't so bad after all. That's what we're saying.
No, absolutely. Well, you've got to enjoy the good bits.
Yeah, definitely. And we've certainly enjoyed this conversation, Martin. Thank you so much for doing this. Just to sign off, where can people find you? Are your books still in publication? Are you still writing for the Evening Standard, etc., etc.?
If you go on if you Google me and put Evening Standard or Telegraph, you'll find stuff I've written. I write a column in diesel and eco car magazine called Motor Grump, which is a sort of monthly rant, which is great fun to do. If you're into narrow boats, which I'm sure you are, there's a monthly magazine called The Telegraph, and I'm the assistant editor on that. And so, if you want to break from cars and want to know about inland waterways, that's a gratuitous plug for the magazine. But I write a lot of that as well. I'm like the poor. I'm always with you.
I've got tea with the Tillerman now and stuck in my head. So.
And I know what that is, and that dates back.
Yes, I knew you would. Martin, it's been absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much for doing this, and we'll catch up with you again soon. Take care.
So, you want something sleek and glamorous, and then check out the Jaguar E-Type featured in our launch issue, alongside many other features such as
buying guides, owner's tips, and even how to buy your own first classic car.
GoClassics is about the cars that you relate to, the cars that you've dreamed of, and the cars that you can own, run, and enjoy. At GoClassics, we'll tell you how.
GoClassics is the most exciting car magazine on the shelves today, and it's out now. And you can get one by heading over to goclassics.co.uk, where you can find some of our fantastic limited time subscription offers.
forget about the boring, the pompous, the self-important. If you want something new,
GoClassics!